Yeah, I think okay. So, welcome everybody, and this panel is called "Is America Land of Freedom?" And we'll have two speakers followed by two discussants. And I'll just briefly introduce the speakers. Kennan Ferguson is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin, and his work has spanned a real wide range of topics in political theory, from the politics of silence and community cookbooks to William James. And he'll open our panel with a presentation of the basic ideology of freedom and why, in particular, we need to be suspicious of freedom as the only metric of politics, and offer some provocations on alternative ways to conceptualize politics. Jerome Kohn is director of the Hannah Arendt Center at the New School, and in 4 volumes of Arendt's unpublished and uncollected writings, with 2 more to come, he's traced the intellectually and circumstantially complex background of Arendt's thought in an effort to shed light on the misunderstandings to which her thought has so often been subjected. And in Jerome Kohn's talk, he'll possibly take up the challenge that I think Professor Ferguson's talk introduces, and present in this framing of freedom and its in the presentation of freedom and its alternatives, present, I think, a rich account of the connection of politics to freedom in particular, and the possibilities of this connection therein. Our two discussants are Jennifer Hudson, who's an associate fellow at the Arendt Center and holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University, and is also an instructor at the Barred Prison Initiative. And her work addresses the affinities and tensions between bureaucracy and democracy. And finally, Thomas Wild is assistant professor of German at Bard College, and his research focuses on 20th century German literature and culture, and he's also one of 3 editors-in-chief preparing the first critical edition of Hannah Arendt's complete writings in English and in German. And with that, we'll open with Kennan Ferguson.
Hi again. I want to just start off by thanking Bard College, the Hannah Arendt Center, and Professor Berkowitz for having us begin this discussion with this wonderful and long day of these ideas. I'm looking forward to tomorrow as well. I want to actually start off my presentation with a connection to the very last question that was asked about habit, because I'm interested here ultimately in defending habit against freedom. How I'm going to get there, you'll see in a moment. But I want you to start off by thinking of what it would be like to be an alien coming to the United States, either of the international or the extraterrestrial variety. And you might be startled by the amount of talk and effort that we give to the concept of freedom. Calls for freedom are ubiquitous, and the particularities of those calls are very diverse. Both of the major political parties in the United States commit themselves to the Constitution, to the collective good, and especially to freedom and liberty. But they prove strangely oppositional when it comes to these concepts. Liberty for what? For gays to marry and flags to be burned? For corporations to profit without taxation? For prayers to be led by principles? Which part of the Bill of Rights, for example, is more important, the First or the Second Amendment? As Lincoln put it, we all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. I'm suggesting this alien's eye view to lay out a few of my overarching presumptions. Number 1, modern citizens feel a strong attachment to freedom. Number 2, we also feel a strong connection to forms of unfreedom, such as those found in being part of an organized religion, a community, or a formal organization. Note, for example, the important role that promise and contract play in our lives. Those are both forms of unfreedom. And number 3, that a political party to be successful must find a way to integrate these oppositions into an overall viewpoint. So thus, in the contemporary United States, we have a political right, let's call them the Republicans, who are dedicated to economic forms of freedom, but suspicious of moral and societal freedoms. These are not, I would add, what we should think of historically or conceptually as conservatives, because conservatism as a philosophy would support already existing social formulations over free market solutions, to use the first panel today, would support the small family business over Walmart. We also have a political left, let's call them Democrats, who are generally supportive of moral and societal freedoms, but suspicious of economic freedom. They are not, I would also hasten to add, traditional conceptual liberals, because liberalism as a philosophy opposes constraining individualism in any way to support larger social goals. What both sides have in common is a commitment to freedom deeply conjoined to the necessity to limit other forms of freedom. Thus, each of these positions hearkens to freedom and liberty as a lodestone while sidestepping certain oppositional freedoms which they find inconvenient. And I don't think the major parties in the US are alone in this. I could go through 3 examples. If one thinks of what we have historically thought of the opposite of freedom, that is, the philosophical tradition known as Marxism, that actually is also based on an idea of freedom. If you look carefully at Marx and Engels, you'll notice that their version of the communist system would allow the individual leisure and intellectual flourishing in eliminating the oppression of the working class and freeing them from the class system. A second example would be that of the 1970s form of feminism in the United States, which came to be known as women's liberation. This was based on a structural understanding of how the politics of sex and gender operated in the domestic sphere as well as the political sphere. Liberatory feminism hoped that individual, small group, and social analytics could oppose patriarchal structures which limited women's participation in the workplace, in intellectual life, and in law and politics. A third example, perhaps the most fervid, would be that of contemporary libertarianism, which traces its influence to John Stuart Mill's liberalism in arguing that most forms of governmental limitations on individual and corporate freedom are illegitimate. Libertarians point to the contradictions in a governmental system which purports to be free, but which limits people's use of property and wealth through taxation, zoning, and regulation. In dreaming of a world without confiscatory law, libertarians point to and argue about the few collective necessities needed to protect individual freedom. So I'll refer to all of these, contrary to one another as they are, as various idioms of freedom. We could add a lot of others to the list: national liberation movements, cosmopolitanism, international marketplaces, religious freedom laws, even critical thought itself, all base themselves in central and crucial ways on freedom. Each presents itself as a vehicle of liberation. So, given the strength and pervasiveness of these idioms of freedom, what is the opposite of freedom? One that is valuable and powerful enough to draw us away from freedom's clear attractions. There's one partial, but I think insufficient answer, and that is community. The philosopher G.W.F. Hegel points to 3 kinds of unfreedom in the philosophy of right, each of which is embraced along the way to one's individualism being fully synthesized in a larger whole. Number 1, the family. Civil society is number 2, and the state is the highest form. For Hegel's purposes, each of these is a step to fully achieving what he calls ethical life, overcoming the subjective particularity into which we are born. Those are his words. For our purposes, the family serves as a good example for this. Hegel's question, sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly asked, is this: why would any self-sufficient individual, competent and independent, choose to sacrifice his freedoms, and for Hegel it's always a male, to join a family? The answer is that we feel ourselves enlarged and augmented in a family dynamic. Though marriage and family is limited in an overt and direct sense, that is, we commit to care, to sexual exclusivity, to familial interdependence, and to shared sacrifice, we ourselves are increased in that dynamic. We, again men, have a domestic sphere which helps take care of our physical needs and provides an emotional and caretaking backdrop from which we can live our larger lives. There is something potentially greatening about family, one worth sacrificing one's independence for. If one can overlook Hegel's casual sexism, and that's a big if, one can understand the appeal of this particular form of unfreedom, and thus the expansion of his ideas to civil society and the state, which completely synthesizes our sense of freedom as unfreedom and unfreedom as freedom. But I'm not entirely convinced by this answer. While I share Hegel's recognition of community as one appealing form of unfreedom, I think there are other individualizing ones as well. And to name these, I turn to a more contemporary political philosopher, Gilles Deleuze, and his concept of intensification. Here's an example. A 9-year-old girl becomes fascinated by soccer and decides to become expert at it. Each day, she voluntarily goes outside to kick a ball against a wall, over and over, aiming at a particular spot, learning how it bounces and rebounds, getting more accurate at hitting it from farther and farther away. The girl kicks the ball day after day, learning the precise force, angle, and points of contact on it to send it to a designated spot. She learns the particularities of the wall also, its angles and responses. Her body reacts quickly, almost without thinking, to the unexpected rebound, the too high shot. Even when she kicks wrong, she can now foresee where the ball will strike and what its ricochet trajectory will look like. She gets better. She takes pleasure in the repetition and drilling. She improves herself in an activity she cares about. So what do we call this kind of action? Patience, habit, rehearsal, learning, and experience. Each of these aspects of endeavor are important, politically salient, and valuable, but they are not freedom. They're closer to an antithesis of freedom. Habituation and learning are ways of intensifying aspects of selfhood that the individual finds important by unfreeing the self. When I habituate forms of competence, for example, the ability to walk or the ability to read without thinking about what one is doing, that activity recedes from my consciousness. I stop making decisions about it. It stops being a question of freedom. So why, I want to ask in conclusion, is freedom the only idiom we allow to stand in for a kind of salutary politics? Why is that the goal? Why do we presume that political efficacy increases freedom? What about, for example, the pious who work to get closer to God? What about, say, teachers who repeat information and techniques to a never-ending stream of junior high students? What about the practices of domesticity, or of refusal, or of quiet reflection? And what about the refashionings of identities in a modern world, those taken up by Native American tribal communities, or Hasidim, or Hawaiian language schools, or Quranic madrasas? Many people dedicate themselves to these practices. Are we to remove them from the realm of the political? Is their lack of freedom an inferior form of politics? Now, their practices are not ours, not really. Those of us here are outwardly facing, critical, searching, freeing. That's why we are here having this conversation. Those are the values celebrated by higher education and by Hannah Arendt, by academics and by intellectuals. But they're not the only values, not the only politics. Other people, and even ourselves sometimes, value and practice forms of unfreedom, whether aimed at community or at personal excellence. Let us challenge ourselves to think beyond freedom.
I want to thank, first of all, Roger for bringing so many really interesting people together to confer with and to talk to, as is his wont. But when he and I first talked about this conference, we were talking of it in terms of a remark that Hannah Arendt made, a question she asked after the Second World War, not too long after it, and after she had published her book on totalitarianism. And she said in all these fightings in the Second World War against totalitarianism, the people fighting knew what they were fighting against, but what are they fighting for? And that kind of haunted me, that question. It's not the question of the conference today, not directly, but I thought we'd try to find out what this freedom is. Clearly, it's what she had in mind, what this freedom is and why it is basic to all other freedoms, political freedom, and just how strange it is. According to Arendt, political freedom was taken more or less for granted in the ancient world until, and it was a political matter, it was simply freedom was the state of the people in a good promise. Then, it wasn't until St. Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries, perhaps the only real philosopher the Romans ever produced. It's not only Arendt who said that, but Etienne Gilson and others. He, for the first time, according to Arendt and others, thought about freedom. That is to say, when a thinker thinks, there's always a problem. It wasn't just taken for granted anymore. There was a great, great problem that Augustine saw in human freedom. And he saw it in very briefly, the will which was split, and he called it monstrous. This freedom is monstrous, and his work is an overcoming of that monstrousness of the freedom he discovered. This paper, in its original version, was to have quite a good deal to do with Augustine, but that's been cut out. There may be one mention of him later, but by and large, that's cut out because he's an extremely difficult thinker. Time is limited, and he's also a bit wearisome and repetitive, and he kind of goes off. I think he wrote more than any man that ever lived, as far as I know. But even Heidegger. But he goes off on tangents. Anyway, what I call this paper is the fact of freedom, and that I hope, in the course of this, will come to be a fair characterization in your ears of what Arendt actually thought freedom to be, a fact. And by the way, not in a concatenation where something is caused by something else, and the thing that is the cause of the effect is supposed to be greater than it's nothing like that. There's no causality. There's no concatenation at all. We'll see, I think, that. So let me get into this. Hannah Arendt opposes freedom to necessity, or to put it differently, action to acquiescence in the knowledge of what must be. First of all, she didn't believe in anybody there was any knowledge of what must be. But it's true that goes against the whole, I mean, certainly Mr. Hegel, whose whole idea was to reconcile the freedom with necessity, to get rid of the contingency. Now, hers is not that. It is not to acquiesce, not to search for that reconciliation of freedom and necessity. To enter what she calls a public realm suffused with light requires both courage and trust. Courage because our entrance affects a living web of relations, and we cannot know in advance what that effect will be. And trust, as in friendship, because no beginning is even thinkable apart from it. The mutuality of trust is key to Arendt's well-known discussion in The Human Condition of the act of promising, which by binding together political equals limits to an extent the sheer haphazardness of what the future brings. One outstanding example of this, and Roger mentioned this morning, but I want to do it again, a classic example of men bound in trust is the Mayflower Compact. This covenant was made aboard ship, possibly due to the contingency of the bad weather that prevented the Pilgrims from landing in Virginia, where they would have been under the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company. Roger mentioned all this, I know, but when you read this on Revolution, what it is, you can hear the delight in Arendt's voice. Wow, we don't have any weather records, actually, but wouldn't that be great if it were all a matter of contingency, of the wind blowing? And there's some evidence of that there was. To Arendt, the astounding fact of the whole story is that their obvious fear of these pilgrims of one another as individuals was accompanied by the no less obvious confidence they had in their power to combine themselves together in a civil body politic, held together solely by the strength of mutual promise. These political bodies formed circa 1620 were not governments, by the way, and would not be formed into a government for another 150 years, till the 1770s. No theory, theological or political or philosophical, but their own decision to leave the old world behind and to venture forth into an enterprise entirely of their own led into a sequence of acts and occurrences in which they would have perished had they not turned their minds to the matter long and intensely enough to discover the elementary grammar of political action and its more complicated syntax. What Arendt means by the grammar of political action is the mutual confidence of many in many, while the rules of its syntax determine the rise and fall of human power. Now, it is quite unusual usage, I think, of grammar and syntax in this context. And I think it's worthwhile to hear her own words. They're towards the end of the 4th chapter of On Revolution. The pagination in all these editions is different, but it's towards the end of the 4th chapter. The grammar of action, she writes, that action is the only human faculty that demands a plurality of men. That's its condition. The syntax of power, that worldly in-between space by which men are mutually related, combine in the act of foundation by virtue of the making and the keeping of promises, which in the realm of politics may be well the highest human faculty. Now, she goes a step farther, and that step is relevant today. Centuries after the settling of America and the founding of the United States, the power of a republic, which is entirely different from, and indeed the opposite of its means of violence and force, begins to diminish when citizens no longer consent to the ways their representatives, the officials they empower by electing them, act and speak. She describes the situation in this country in 1970 as one in which those empowered by being elected continue to feel power even after the people withdraw the basis of that power. The important point here is that this is not due to divisions among the people, but rather to the people's loss of confidence in the so-called system. The empowered officials then begin to act like rulers and resort to force. For Arendt, the substitution of force for the assent of the people is a turning point, a crisis. At the time, she was speaking of the war in Vietnam, which of course did divide the people, but far more important to her was the loss of confidence it brought, and with it, the loss of American power. It was at that point that trust disappeared. For confidence, confidere in Latin, it's a strong Latin term for trust. The genius of the American language is it pulls on Latin and Germanic to mean not always exactly the same thing. If we agree with Arendt that confidence makes political beginnings possible, and that any venture into the public realm is rash, reckless, and foolhardy without trust, which is difficult to formulate but fundamental in what is human in all people, the question is, where is trust in politics today? Or better, in which of our elected officials have we confidence? Here it may be appropriate to say something about state or national sovereignty, which is something of a taboo in political discourse. Its origins stretching back at least as far as Henri de Navarre, who became Henri IV of France at the end of the 16th century. You know, he's the guy, he was raised a Huguenot. This is when France was ravaged by the Huguenot and Catholic wars. And he was raised a Huguenot. He became the first Bourbon king of France. And he became a Catholic to take Paris, in a very famous phrase. He said, Paris vaut bien une messe. Paris is well worth a mass. But almost immediately afterwards, he made freedom of religion. He gave the Huguenots the right. He himself became a Catholic, but he extended the right of freedom of religion. I believe that Arendt sees and states clearly why political sovereignty and political freedom are mutually exclusive. I also want at least to hint or attempt to hint at what Arendt sees as the relation of politics and freedom, in which may lie the most plausible answer to her question, what are we fighting for? The first thing to remark is that traditional thought offers us no help in these matters. The philosophic tradition first considered freedom when it was no longer experienced in action, but in the mental faculty of the will. Traditionally then, the freedom of the will enters the political realm as willpower, and eventually as Nietzsche's will to power. Its issue is sovereignty, not Henri de Navarre's sovereignty anymore, which was tactical and to end those terrible wars. Its issue is sovereignty as independence from others and the ability, if necessary, to prevail against them, which was dear to the German political theorist Carl Schmitt, for example. But to equate freedom with sovereignty is for Arendt to deny freedom. For her, non-sovereignty is not at all the same as dependence, as claimants of sovereignty would have it. To politicians, typically, sovereignty is the basic condition of independence, which is why the sovereignty of a nation or state is held by most of them to be all but sacrosanct. Except, of course, when it isn't, when they're invaded. While it has always been obvious that man in the singular is not sovereign, that human life as such depends on others, for Arendt, man in the singular is not even imaginable. She sees that if there were but one man, humanity would be an illusion. But political sovereignty is no less an illusion, rather like American exceptionalism, of a people behaving as if they were one, and indeed the only one, where men, either as individuals or in organized groups, wish to be sovereign, they must abolish freedom, she says. But if they wish to be free, it is precisely sovereignty they must renounce. Now, as a point towards what this panel is supposed to be considering, whether America is a free land or not, let me ask, and please, anybody who knows the answer, just sing it out, please. How many times does the word sovereignty appear in the American Constitution? Anybody? It doesn't appear. There is no such word as sovereignty. And the 6th article of the Constitution actually denies sovereignty as pretty clearly as it could be. That is when treaties, foreign treaties, are taken to be as the most basic law of the land. The language is even grander than that. It's like a treaty is at least as important as any other law, and it's binding. Human freedom for Arendt is not a matter of either metaphysics or ideology, but it is a matter of fact. An unfamiliar fact, I reckon, to approach which it may help to look at her distinction in German between the words Freiheit and Fries. The former being the usual German term for freedom, Freiheit, and Fries is far less familiar. It's not used a lot at all. Thomas would know more about this than me. Freiheit is entirely being in a state of freedom, or perhaps just being free. This is the fact of freedom that I think Arendt wants to get at. A humble example may suffice. Kant's right to go visiting, in which picking up and moving, visiting, offering and accepting hospitality are modes of being free. The right to go visiting may be institutionalized as a citizen's right to a passport, yet as Edward Snowden recently discovered, the small blue folio is an equivocal guarantee of being free to move and travel. Being free is to take part in the activities of acting and speaking with others in a common world, activities whose virtue does not consist in moral values, but on the contrary, in virtuosity. To put it differently, being free is a sort of knowledge, a knowing how to navigate both communal and political images to move about and delight in contingent events, which, because they are unforeseen, are worth remembering and fashioning into stories to be told and retold. Precisely here, one may hear intimations of the voice of poetry, the voice of all creative arts, in the plurality of political voices. Do not, for example, Matthew Arnold's images in Dover Beach, written more than 150 years ago, seem especially apropos today. He writes, "The world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confusion, confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night." Yet politics and poetry are no more the same than beginning and creating. The voice of poetry is probably closer to philosophy, for in eliminating or rationalizing contingent events, the poet and philosopher's experience of being free is self-limiting. The relationship of being free to politics is unique insofar as freedom lives between men and women when they speak and act spontaneously. The example of René Char, the French poet whose book Hypnos Waking, Sleep-Waking, contains a series of aphorisms written furtively in the heat of battle in World War II from 1943 to 1944, is of both being free and its limitation. Char fought with the French resistance as one of many called maquisards, the resistors, who invented a common language. A common language they invented, unintelligible to outsiders, which arose out of their sense of wonder, writes Char, communicated by the beings and things. It's much better in French, les êtres et les choses, the beings and things they lived with in communal intimacy. These beings and things appeared and astonished them as the appearance of the immortal gods astonished ancient heroes in Homer. In circumstances of life and death, a world opened itself to these resistors, which had lain hidden within their familiar world, and it was there, in the contingencies of action, that they discovered the treasure of freedom. Char writes, "I love those so much enamored of freedom that they sacrifice themselves to keep freedom from dying. These men were bound together, hidden in darkness, fighting not against but for something more real than anything they had known before the war. Yet, when the war ends, Char realizes that, along with their action, the freedom of the resistors will disappear as suddenly as it had appeared. The overwhelming sense of the reality of freedom in action and speech will vanish from their lives as if it never existed. But for the poet René Char himself, the meaning of the lost treasure of freedom is illuminated in a 375-year-old painting, which I'm going to try to show you. Oh, sorry. Is it back? Is it there? Oh God. I pressed it twice. Now I should do it again, I think. Should I do it again? Is it there? Can you see? Is there too much light on it? Can you make it out? It's a magnificent painting. 375 years old. It's called The Prisoner. It's by Georges Latour. Char recognizes that the woman is explaining, the prisoner listening, the words falling from this terrestrial silhouette of a red angel are essential words. They help at once. Deep in the dungeon, the tallow minutes of light trace and dissolve the features of the sitting man. Skidding as a dry nettle, he has no memory to shake him. The bowl, which you may be able to see, it's between his feet, the feeding bowl, is a ruin. It's all broken, but the swollen gown suddenly fills the whole dungeon. The word of the woman gives birth to the unhoped for. Now, a contemporary American poet, I think it's interesting, Charles Wright, who is actually our poet laureate, in somewhat the same vein, summons regret for the actions he has missed. Where, quoting Charles Wright, where are the deeds we're taught to cling to? How I regret having missed them, and they're mirrored pieces of heaven. Now, I'll turn this off. Is it off? Good. Readers of Hannah Arendt are familiar with the frequency with which she quotes Edmund Burke on acting in concert. But it's worthwhile hearing the whole of what Burke says in regard to the belief that no man could act with effect who did not act in concert. These are Burke's words. That no man could act in concert who did not act with confidence. That no men could act with confidence who were not bound together by common opinions, common affections, and common interests. And one might add that whether or not actions are successful, their performance, as Arendt puts it, remains directed towards the constantly renewed actualization of freedom. There are great dangers in the abandonment of politics. Now that's another word I wanted to ask Thomas. The word in German is Entpolitisierung, which is translated sometimes as depolitization. I don't know what depolitization means. Is that a good thing, a bad thing? I don't know, but Entpolitisierung is the abandonment of politics, is it not? Which is what she said happened in totalitarianism. But these dangers are in all politics, and they are so constricting, especially automatism and stagnation, that many of us today are inclined to consider the freedom we experience as freedom from politics, or as some might say, negative freedom. Now, at the end of these observations, a remark about Augustine may be apropos. Originally, I intended to argue that Arendt's grasp of human freedom is the most embracing since Augustine's. Or to put it quite differently, in Arendt, the understanding of human freedom has come to an end worthy of its beginning in Augustine, who understood freedom as a gift bestowed by God on men to act not through external necessity, but through a love beyond human understanding or control. Not caused. This was a gift of God to men. It follows that in Augustine, the motive for assuming the burden of earthly politics, including the waging of war, is love of one's neighbor, not fear of him. He's considered one of the great theorists of the just war theory. Well, the just war theory depends just on that. war to be just, it must be conducted out of love of one's neighbor, not fear. The seemingly strange affinity between Hannah Arendt, a 20th century Jewess, and the Catholic saint who died 1,500 years before she was born, whom she referred to as her old friend, is anchored, as Arendt's readers will know, in the human capacity to begin. In slight variations, Augustine's word in Latin, initium ad esset, creatus est homo, is thematic in all Arendt's major writings, essays, including the books, as well as the books. That there, Augustine means that there might be a beginning in the very continuity of time, not the beginning of time, but a beginning in the continuity of time. Man was created. As Arendt says, the full significance of beginnings was discovered by the one great thinker who lived in a period which in some respects resembled our own more than any other in recorded history, and who wrote under the full impact of a claustrophobic end which perhaps resembles the end to which we have come. Now, she's referring to the sack of Rome in 410 by the Visigoths. Rome never really recovered from that, but it lasted for well over 1,000 years in one form or another, and included the periods of decline are always far greater than the periods of freedom in human history. But it lasted. It lasted until it included the Dark Ages. And remember how Arendt herself wrote a book about her own Dark Ages, the men in dark times. However, more than this would require another paper. Let me close this one with a quotation from Arendt that puts in a nutshell what I've been trying to say. Freedom to depart and begin something new and unheard of, or the freedom to interact in speech with many others and experience the diversity that the world always is in its totality, most certainly was and is not the end or purpose of politics, something that can be achieved by political means. It is rather the substance and meaning of all things political. In this sense, he says, in this sense, politics and freedom are identical. Thank you.
Some brief comments and open up to questions.
I have questions mainly for Kennan Ferguson. First, I want to thank Roger Berkowitz for including me in this panel and in the conference. And so I want to start by thanking you for both of the papers, which were very interesting. And I like especially, Kennan, how you reframed the question of the panel, basically. Instead of saying whether or not America is free, you say, why do we care? Whether or not it's free. And you talk about these different idioms of freedom and how they combine forms of freedoms and unfreedoms, basically. And I'm wondering, so first of all, my first question has to do with what's at stake in describing some of these things as either freedom or unfreedom. Because, so you mentioned several theorists, philosophers, Hegel, for example. Hegel thought that he was talking about freedom the whole time. He thought that community was freedom. He thought it was a truer form of freedom than license would be, or simply resisting against things. Because in resisting against something, you're determined by that thing that you're resisting against, right? So these theorists care about these forms of unfreedom because they think they're freedom. So I'm not sure, I'm wondering what's attractive about unfreedom and these particularly. But then while I was listening to you, I was thinking, yeah, you know, some of these things that you're describing as not freedom are really attractive, actually. So I went with you on that point. And for example, you said that you want to defend the idea that habit is something that's important for us, even if it's not freedom. And I started thinking, though, but isn't habit can be something that's enabling. It frees us maybe from the tyranny of choice about everything in life at all times. And so I'm wondering if we don't just care about a lot of different kinds of freedom. And so I was also thinking about the other examples that you gave. For example, the little girl who's learning to play soccer and who's training, and you know, you could say that about anyone who's training for anything, right? She's placing limits on herself, but these limits are really enabling, actually, and allow her in the end to do something that she wouldn't otherwise have been able to do. And so I'm thinking that the limits actually, the things that may seem to be limits to freedom could actually be enabling and might help us to fight for something rather than fight against it. So, yeah, what's attractive about unfreedom, and are we even talking about unfreedom? I'm wondering. And that's it. Thank you.
Well, I take up the part of responding mainly to Professor Kohn's. This is number 6, because number 5 is here. Okay, good. I will respond to Jerome Kohn's paper, and since you were referring mainly to an essay that I think has not yet appeared in English by Hannah Arendt, an essay that was written in German in 1958 on Freiheit and Politik, on freedom and politics. At the beginning of that essay, Arendt says, when we talk about freedom and politics, there's always a multiplicity of resonances going on. And this multiplicity of resonances have to do with traditions of thought, of political thought, with memories that have sedimented in our language, and also with contemporary experiences. Those all sort of come together when we talk about politics and freedom at the same time. And I just want to address some moments of those aspects that I think resonate with your presentation. First of all, I want to follow up on 2 concepts that Jerome Kohn has pointed out in that regard, and that's the unusual understanding that Arendt offers of sovereignty, and that freedom is a gift only given under the condition of giving up sovereignty. Yeah? So that a Christian notion of the free will, as well as an ancient notion of freedom of thought, is replaced by a different notion of freedom, and that is a freedom that does not exist within myself, but it only exists and can only be experienced in relation to each other. Yeah? So the experience of freedom in relation to each other is often linked to Burke's acting in concert, and this was also mentioned. But I was also reminded of a different context of philosophy and also of political philosophy that we could find, for example, in Merleau-Ponty and an early 20th century thinking about the political space and about the questions of freedom of contemporaries by Arendt that are not as much in the core of her writing, but given your presentation, maybe can brought into the conversation. Then there was another term that you mentioned, how Arendt terms here her understanding of freedom that is rather a way of being free than freedom. And this term is virtuosity. So not virtue, but virtuosity. which only exists and realizes itself in the actual act of acting. So we know virtuosity from the performing arts. Yeah? For this freedom that exists in the practice of virtuosity is not a product. It cannot exist as an object independent from those who are acting. The consideration of freedom and being free is similar to playing music or to dance or to acting on stage, which only exists as long as the performance goes on.
The performing arts.
The performing arts, yeah. And so I was wondering of whether what you would say, whether we find an echo of this notion of freedom in the sense of frei sein, of being free, also in the mode of Arendt's writing. That is, that there is a particular performative quality of Arendt's writing, often of writing with poetry, that you responded to also by giving your presentation with poetry and with art as interlocutors of your theoretical considerations. That there is a way of writing that cannot be fully translated or reduced into a product of thought, right? Not into a morale, not into a commandment, but into a different sort of interaction. And that this can be called or virtuosity potentially as well.
Just say that a little bit, go back just a little bit, Thomas, because you said something very important, but I didn't get it. Oh, I just asked Thomas to repeat something.
So my question was whether this notion of freedom as rather as a way of being free, which only lasts as long as the actual performance lasts, is actually can be found in the way how Arendt's writing is crafted, so to speak. And as a conclusion, I want to give one example how this works also in that particular essay on freedom and politics. Because the key sentence in that essay in German is, der Sinn von Politik ist Freiheit. So roughly the sense or meaning of politics is freedom. But the German also suggests a different reading. You can also read it saying that politics itself had a sense or a sensate reasoning of freedom and for freedom. Yeah? And so Arendt's English translation of that sentence is interesting because she says the raison d'être of politics is freedom. It not only echoes René Char's French, but I hear two things. One is an echo of actually frei sein, this being free, the être in the French, the raison d'être of politics is freedom, so that she actually brings in a plurality of languages a being free also in her English way of wording or phrasing her understanding of the connection between politics and freedom. And I also read here a critique of, when she uses raison d'être, a critique of raison d'état. So her understanding of freedom is opposed, or not opposed, is contrary to a national interest, a raison d'état, but it has to do with a raison d'être, with a way of being.
That's the substance of her attack on national security.
And maybe we'll open up for questions.
Let me just ask the one concluding question that I have, please, because I want to rephrase the panel. The panel's question is America a land of freedom? Based on the presentation, would you say, is America a land of frei sein, of being free?
Great. And
if not, why? And if yes, where?
Great. And we should open up for questions from the audience, and then sort of pick up on the comments and questions from the discussants as well. Yeah. We're running out of time. Yeah, so let's try to get some questions from the audience before we open it up back to the panelists. There's a question on this side of the room over there. Oh, did someone have their... I thought you had your hand up over here. No?
Those were really very interesting and rich panels, and I want to ask Kennan and Jerry. If we understand how Jerry's expressed Arendt's idea of being free as a kind of virtuosity, it sounds very much like what Kennan means by intensification and habit in the 9-year-old learning the intricacies of soccer or playing piano. And then it comes down to what Jennifer's question to Kennan was, which is, in a way, you could describe these ways of being unfree as ways of being free, but you choose to turn it around as to ask about unfreedom. And so I'm interested in, if there really, can you accept the way that these two things are very similar? And if so, why do you turn it around? And I'm wondering what Jerry thinks about that turnaround as well. That turnaround.
Yeah, I find the constant turn to those idioms of freedom sort of fundamentally impoverishing. That is, if we talk about things like habit or play or virtuosity, those are combinations of either social or individual expertise along lines of newness. But they are, but by referring to them only as freedom, or even using only the metric of freedom to say how valuable they are, we end up replicating this sort of hierarchy of freedom, unfreedom, that freedom is the only thing that counts. And so we find ourselves in having our political discussions, having questions where we want to ask everything along lines of freedom, even when that doesn't make sense.
Are you willing to say then that we're fighting for unfreedom?
I'd say we are sometimes living for unfreedom. That is what we do when we work at talking and reading and even thinking, is training ourselves in modes of habituation that are meant to allow us to be more intense kinds of people in certain ways through being unfree, through ultimately being unthinking. And by only ever talking about something being, is this freeing or not, whether it's a protest or somebody putting on a veil, we end up being unable to ask some very interesting questions about those practices because we only have this very, very shallow language in which to talk about it.
Can I ask a question? So that makes sense to me, what you just said, but I'm wondering then, so it seems that you're worried about the way that the term freedom can be emptied out, and basically if we use it for everything, it then means nothing. And so you want us to talk about what's valuable to us politically in more specific terms, because that would be more helpful in discussion, right? And so I'm wondering if we could still call these things freedom, but that it's pointless to just talk about freedom. We need to talk about specifically what is good about these specific types of freedom and why we should fight for that.
Or talk about something else. That is, freedom is only one nexus of what we might consider political life. It's one we've paid a lot of attention to. But we don't pay attention to, say, the human sensorium, that set of physical sensory experiences that in many ways makes us who we are. We don't talk about family life, which is so often both felt as a realm of unfreedom and literally experienced as a realm of unfreedom. We don't talk about things like care, because those are not about freedom. And because we end up talking as though freedom is the only politically salient reference point, those aspects of our lives fall out of our discussions. And I'm looking for languages and words and poetries that bring those back in.
The only thing I'd like to add is that Arendt is, of course, fully aware that political freedom is not the only, I don't like that word, value, but in the world, it isn't at all. There are many, many other things. But it is without political freedom, those can be erased so quickly, and that was her experience of totalitarianism. In that sense, it's fundamental for her.
The microphone.
Right there.
The girl practicing soccer, I mean, to me, that was the epitome of unfreedom because that's compulsion. And if you're compulsive about something, I don't see how you're free. I just wanted your thoughts about that. And then to our German professor, I'm sure he knows this, the Heidelberg song, Die Gedanken sind frei. And almost, that's the only thing that's free if you sing the whole verse, because they can't be shot, they can't be killed, they can't be known by other people. And so they cannot be criticized, they cannot be influenced. You can be alone in your thoughts. And I wonder what that kind of free means, might mean to Hannah Arendt or to the general discussion. Do you understand what I was saying?
Not really.
You know the song, Die Gedanken sind frei, wer kann sie erraten? Well, the thoughts are free. And there's, in the sense of the song to me, is it's the only thing that's really free, is your own thoughts to yourself. I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Okay. So we often have a negative response to the idea of habit because it so quickly becomes something like fingernail biting or knuckle cracking, or in its more virulent form, something like alcoholism or anorexia. That habits is understood in those examples as being something outside of the will that freedom seems to be all about. And I think it's important to take that kind of habituation, say, of a body, very seriously as well. Those are political effects. And they're not just political failures in the way in which somebody who is entirely invested in an independent will would see them as.
Aristotle's ethics is really about habits, isn't it?
In fact, a lot of the Greek, one of the reasons I think you're right that Arendt finds Plato such an odd Greek guy is that the Greeks understand a lot of these aspects, and Plato really overtly is rejecting them and trying to give us a different kind of life. So.
We have time for maybe just one more question from the audience. Over there in the fifth one.
I just think we forget to mention the spirit that goes with all of that. You have action and relationship, but then you have the spirit, because if you, let's say, practice, take that girl again, then when you have practiced and you're proficient in it, you have that extra freedom in action to do what you couldn't do if you weren't proficient. And in politics, one could say, well, we have to have some order, and that order should be in our automatic nervous system so we don't kill each other, so that when we have a structure, we then can interact without having the fear that the other one is going to kill me.
I think that's exactly right. And we do it a disservice by calling that freedom.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to have to stop now and open it up to the general sort of comments from all the panelists. So if all the panelists could come up, and if the two of you could stay up here. Thank you very much.